We have a special episode today and a special guest. Patricia Skiple has been identified after 29 years. For all that time, she was only known as the Blue Pacheco Jane Doe, whose remains were discovered in 1993. She disappeared at age 45, and for decades she was frozen at that age. Known only as Blue Pacheco because of the blue clothing she was found wearing when her remains were discovered in 1993. But while her identity remained a mystery, the truth is that they knew for most of that time who took her life. A man named Keith Jesperson, known as a smiley face killer, was to blame. A man who most would never have even guessed was capable of what he did. We have a special guest telling the story of Keith Jesperson today, and I'll tell you the story of Patricia later on. If you get a chance, please tune in to Ty Knott's True Mysteries channel, which you can see here, but you will also be able to find in the links below. So here we go.
Keith Jesperson is a man who, at first glance, may not seem like much. By all means, he looks like your everyday guy that you'd run into at the local Walgreens or Starbucks. But in reality, Keith was one of the most heinous criminals to have ever lived. Keith Jesperson claims to have taken the lives of more than 185 people, though police have only been able to confirm 8 of these cases. If his story is true, and it may very well be, then Keith would be the most prolific criminal in American history. Keith was born back in 1955 to his father Les and his mother Gladys. To say Keith had a normal childhood would be an outright lie. He faced every type of punishment, neglect, and abuse you could imagine, both at the hands of his father and his grandfather. Keith would often tell stories of the punishments that his father would deal out, and they were so horrific that police didn't even believe him. However, when author Jack Olson later dug deeper into these accusations, he was able to confirm that virtually every story was entirely true. As a kid, Keith never fit in with the other boys his age. He's a very large man, 6 feet 8 inches tall, and he was very tall in his youth as well. Because of this, many of the other kids liked to pick on him, and his own brother gave him the nickname of Igor because of his broad, bullish appearance. Because of this, Keith tended to keep to himself and didn't associate with the other kids much. Though it was this alone time that ultimately led to his first handful of crimes, in which he took the lives of small animals for no other reason than to watch them suffer. One of the most disturbing things to have come from Keith's childhood was that he claims that instead of his father scolding him, his dad was proud of him when he took the lives of animals. He would kidnap dogs, cats, and birds and other pets from people living in his trailer park and subject them to unspeakable acts. No one in his family tried to stop him, and this later grew into a desire to do the same thing to humans. When Keith was just 10 years old, he attempted to claim his first victim. A young boy who would often act out and get into trouble, then claimed that Keith was the one who was really responsible. One day, Keith had had enough of this and decided to enact his revenge. In the end, his father pulled him away before the boy could be seriously injured. But Keith admitted later that his intention was to take the boy's life. A similar scenario played out later on when Keith was held underwater by another boy at a local lake until he blacked out. Sometime later, Keith saw the boy at a local pool and decided to do the same thing to him. Only he didn't plan to let the boy get off so easily. A lifeguard ended up intervening and setting the boy free, but Keith had proven his point. Believe it or not, as Keith got older, he met a young woman named Rose Hawk. After dating for a while, they got married when Keith was just 20 years old, and they had 3 kids together. Keith worked as a truck driver to support his new family, but when strange women continued to call his home phone, his wife began to suspect that he was having affairs with these women. One day, while Keith was out on the road, his wife packed her things, loaded the kids into the car, and moved back to her parents' home in Washington. They divorced soon after, but Keith continued to spend time with his kids when he was in the Washington area when he passed through for his trucking business. It was at this point that something inside of Keith shifted. Now that his wife and children were gone, it seemed as though Keith had nothing else to live for. He became an angry man, both angry with himself and angry with the people around him. Most notably, he seems to have developed a hatred towards women. In January of 1990, Keith met his first victim, Tanya Bennett. He met Tanya at a bar, and the two went back to a home that he'd been renting nearby. Before long, the two got into a verbal disagreement, and Keith lashed out, grabbing Tanya by the neck and taking her life. He would do the exact same thing on August 30th, 1992, to a young woman who is yet to be identified. On that same day, he found yet another victim, this time a woman named Cynthia Rose, who met a similar fate. He would act out again in October of 1993, claiming the life of Laurie Pentland, then again in June, leading to the main victim of today's story, Patricia Skiple.
Patricia Skiple went by the nicknames of Patsy and Patty. I was originally a little puzzled by this case, as the only photo appeared really dated, but she was found in 1993. Which seems a little off for being found in the 90s, especially given the facts of the case. The explanation, however, is that she was an older victim for what we usually find in cases like this. It turns out she was 45 when her life was taken, and the photo was of Patsy in her younger days. Although, since those appeared, quite recently a few more photos have shown up. Ultimately, it's hard to tell how Patsy ended up where she was, but her sister spoke a little about her to the press, saying that Patsy was mother of 2 and a resident of Oregon. She got in a huge fight with her husband and walked out in the middle of the night. She was never heard from again. While this version likely left out much, her family reported that they continued over the years to look for her, to hold out hope that the wife and mother would be found alive somewhere. She simply seemed to disappear. The truth is that Patsy was found near Pacheco Pass, in the westbound lane of a highway outside of Gilroy, California, by a truck driver who'd gotten out to relieve himself. Someone had strangled her and left her there. When Patsy was found, they noted she had a 5-inch abdomen scar as a result of gallbladder surgery, and track marks indicated she was an active heroin user. They noted at the time there was no indication she'd given birth, although the truth is she was in fact a mother. Jesperson would later admit to her murder, but he wouldn't tell the story of what happened until years later, when a cold case detective named Bruce interviewed him. He later described her as looking road hard, saying she was clearly very, very hungry, and that she had come into a truck stop where he was eating himself. He actually described her as looking like she was starving to death. He told the waitress he would like to buy her lunch anonymously, but it was just part of his plan. He revealed himself to her later, away from the eyes of the waitress, to leave no witnesses, telling her that he was the buyer of her meal. It was a great ploy to earn her trust, and it worked. He then offered to give her a ride, telling her that he would hit his brake lights when he was ready to leave, which he did. It was all about not allowing anyone to see him sitting with her, at least nobody that would remember, and it worked. She started out of the restaurant and got in his truck. They got about 45 minutes away before having relations. He would tell the police later that he believed she was a working girl, the same kind of a victim that he usually targeted, although there's no indication for sure that that was in fact what she was doing, that she was in fact what he said, a working girl. All of it really, in the end, on all of his retellings, almost always inserts comments that in his mind made him a victim also, and at least gave some of his actions an excuse. In this one, it was her fault she made him angry, and he strangled her. When Detective Bruce, who was in charge of the Jane Doe that Patsy was considered to be, he was desperate to identify her for years. When asked why he kept trying, he told reporters she was a human being, she had a history, and nobody could care less about that woman, saying that he cared. She's entitled to somebody standing up for her, and in a lot of cases, the cold case officer is the last guy to stand up for anybody. And in this case, he did. It took him years, but he did all he could to find her name. He even traveled the route that Jesperson did, handing out flyers and fighting for DNA to be processed, eventually ending up with a direct interview with Jesperson himself. The detective told the press that he got the impression that she did something to anger Jesperson, who was 300 pounds and 6'6", and able to easily overpower Patsy. He then drove with her body for another 5 hours before tossing her out, 20 miles east of Gilroy, California. This was on June 3rd, 1993, and she was found by another trucker when he stepped out to go to the bathroom. Detective Bruce did all he could, but in the end it would be the DNA Doe Project, GEDmatch, and forensic genealogy that would have the final word, giving Patsy her name back. 29 years after she went missing.
It would seem as though Keith Jesperson had a thing for street workers, as many of his victims would be women of a questionable background. It seems as though he would pick up his victims as he traveled around during his trucking job. But one of the strangest details about Keith Jesperson is that he repeatedly taunted police as they were investigating the various victims that he'd begun to pile up over the years. He first taunted officers after he claimed the life of Tanya Bennett by drawing a large smiley face on a bathroom wall and writing a letter confessing to the crime. However, when this didn't get the attention that he'd hoped for, he decided to begin writing letters directly to the police, signing each letter with a large smiley face, earning him the nickname the Happy Face Killer or the Smiley Face Killer. He managed to evade capture until March of 1995, when Keith was finally arrested in connection to his final victim, Julie Wenningham. As it would turn out, he'd actually been questioned by the police regarding this crime about a week earlier. But they didn't have the necessary evidence at the time, so he was set free. By this point, Keith knew that he'd been caught and understood that it was simply a matter of time before police would be hot on his trail. To remedy this, he decided to take matters into his own hands, and he attempted to claim his own life. Now, I won't get into the disturbing details of how he did this, but it didn't work. He then tried one more time, but failed again. With nowhere else to turn, Keith did the only thing that he knew to do: go to the police and turn himself in, hoping that he'd receive a lighter sentence for his cooperation. This would not happen, though. After Keith began to open up to officers about the extent of his crime, he finally revealed that he'd claimed the lives of 185 people. Though in a private letter written to his brother, he claimed to have only taken the lives of 8 people, all of whom have been accounted for, but one of these victims still remains unidentified. At the end of it all, Keith received 4 life sentences in prison, and by all means, he will never see the light of day again. He's now 67 years old and is being housed in the Oregon State Penitentiary.
Thanks again for our guest today, Ty Knotts, for his collaboration. Please take a moment to visit his channel and watch more of his videos. The link to his channel is found in the description below, as well as a link to a video collaboration that we worked on together for his channel. Thanks everyone for watching. Take care of yourselves and each other.